Okay. Good morning. We kick off the third day of our conference with our third keynote speaker, Professor Marguérite Corporaal from the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures at Radboud University, who holds the chair in Irish Literature in Transnational Contexts. She is the principal investigator and one of the supervisors, together with Lotte and Ingrid de Suarte, of the project Heritagesof of Hunger, Societal Reflections on Past European Famines in Education, Commemoration and Musealization. Corporaal was the principal investigator of the research program Relocated Remembrance, the Great Famine in Irish Diaspora Fiction from 1847 to 1921, for which he was awarded a starting grant for consolidators by the European Research Council. Furthermore, she was principal investigator of the International Network of Irish Famine Studies. She researches Irish literature in transnational contexts and the 19th century representations of regions in literature and culture. She explores European famine in literature, culture, heritage, and education, and studies the role of migrant communities. Among her recent publications, one of them credited, are Relocated Memories, The Great Famine in Irish Diaspora Fiction, 1847-1870, The Great Famine and Social Class, The Great Famine, Visual and Material Cultures, Irish Studies and the Dynamics of Memory, Traveling Irishness in the Long 19th Century, Global Legacies of the Great Irish Famine, Interdisciplinary and Transnational Perspectives. Her lecture today is entitled Heritages of Hunger in Europe, Why They Matter Today. So, Marguérite, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gloria. And it's also a great pleasure that you are chairing this session, because Gloria also worked on the Heritages of Hunger project with us for, almost 2 years?
2 years,
yeah. And did a fantastic job also researching textbooks about the Años del Hambre in Spain. So it's nice that we're sitting at the same table, but we have basically been working together for such a long time. Okay, without further ado, let's get started on the lecture. It's great, I'm delighted to see so many of you actually here today. And I'm going to start with a slide with basically a headline that some of you will have read. The past few months have seen the issue of famine return to the heart of European societal debates. As many media stated in response to concerns expressed by the G7, Putin's ban on the exportation of grain from Ukrainian ports would inevitably exacerbate a worldwide famine. Thus, The Guardian wrote on the 14th of May of this year that Russia's Black Sea blockade would push millions towards famine, especially in countries in Africa, but also in the Middle East, which heavily rely on Ukrainian grain for their food supplies. At the same time, current trade sanctions against Russia said it may eventually cause famine under its citizens. And this is actually a point that was made by Thea Hilhorst of the Erasmus University of Rotterdam in March this year. The present situation in Ukraine has also rekindled international attention for a past that is generally called Holodomor, and we heard already quite a lot about this during the conference. A period of mass starvation under the Stalinist regime. What is more, the rich heritage of the Ukrainian famine in the form of archives, monuments, commemorations, teaching practices and museums, both in the mother country but also in diaspora, is currently reframed in relation to the ongoing conflict. Thus, a tweet by Tatisha Mihu Martin, posted on the 6th of July 2022 about his visit to the Holodomor Memorial in Kiev, relates the Ukrainian famine to Russia's current war politics, stating Russia must not be allowed to use food as a weapon in this immoral and unjustified war. And interestingly enough, if you look at the slide, you can also see he's making a comparison here to Ireland, right? And I think that's an interesting phenomenon I will reflect on in a bit more. Similarly, Mayor Drew Wilkins drew analogies between the Holodomor and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, writing about the rededication ceremony for the Holodomor monument in Jackson Park in Windsor, Ontario. And he actually was arguing that this site serves as a gathering place to remember the horrors of the Ukrainian famine, but also to stand in solidarity as the country faces Russia's illegal invasion. The current reinterpretation of Holodomor monuments in the context of Putin's war in Ukraine illustrates a trend we may witness with regard to European famine heritages over the past years. Past famine legacies are recalled to give meaning to current problems, such as the refugee crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, my keynote lecture today will go into these contemporary reflections on past European famines in light of present tensions and societal developments, discussing how present agendas have led to a reinterpretation of these famines in many different ways. In so doing, this lecture will examine recent heritage projects concerning European famines, addressing actually what I see as three major trends in the formation of new famine legacies. The first is the recovery of lost and often subaltern histories connected to these famines. And the second trend I want to touch upon is what I would like to call the transnational turn in European famine heritage studies and heritage making, which is rooted in, I would say again, three phenomena of its own. First, the existence of a transnational cultural repertoire of famine remembrance. Second, the intersections between the cultural memories of those famines in the homeland and on the one hand, and these of the diasporic communities on the other. And then finally also the increasing multidirectional nature of these famine heritages. And then the third trend that I would like to highlight also in this lecture today is what I would like to call the enactment and reconstruction as important strategies to evoke what Laurence Courrier-Vidis has called vicarious empathy as basically a very important quality of dealing with famine heritage. As amongst others, Astrid Erl has argued, memory is inherently fluid, as it can travel through time and through space, across and also beyond cultures, and in that process attain new meanings which serve present agendas but also future ambitions. Indeed, in the case of the cultural legacies of European famines, we clearly see how they are often utilized and reframed in different contexts. And these are contexts of societal issues, developments, but also you could say with different aims. One of these purposes is the evocation of sympathy for those in difficult circumstances, such as refugees. And also, I think this is a good example that I want to give is basically about Rowan Gillespie's famous famine monument, basically at this Dublin's Custom House Quay, which was presented in 1997. And as you can see on the slide, it consists, I think, of very provocative large bronze sculptures of emaciated figures of Irish men and women walking towards an emigrant vessel. And I once spoke a taxi driver who in 1997 thought, what did I do, what did I drink last night when they're standing there, because they really make an impression, I think. He was really believing he was dreaming, I think, to see these kind of spectral figures standing on the quayside. What is important about this monument is that it became the center of pro-refugee demonstrations in September 2015. The drowning of migrants at the time in the Mediterranean Sea, which we all remember, sparked an awareness that during the Great Famine, Ireland too had been a country of refugees, some of which had lost their lives during the passage at sea, while others had found new homes across the world. And Gillespie's famine monument functioned, you could say, as a site of political mobilization through past remembrance, thereby revealing the existence of what Charlotte McIver would call historical duty. A similar sense of historical duty, in the sense of appreciation for the doctors and nurses which put their own lives at risk at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, was actually, we could say, evoked during a very sober annual Great Famine commemoration on the 18th of May 2020, which was supposed to have taken place in Donegal, but which had to take place at Edward Delaney's famine monument in St. Stephen's Green. During his speech, Ireland's Minister for Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, Josepha Madigan, drew parallels between the heroic fortitude shown by, as she called it, the doctors and nurses of the fever hospitals in and outside of Ireland, who risked their own lives to care for others, and, on the other hand, the same qualities of courage and commitment to others in our healthcare staff today. The ceremony, the site of the monument, and the lines from Evan Boland's poem Quarantine, a poem actually written in 2001, which Madigan read during her speech and which remembered the many Irish who caught famine fever in the workhouses in the worst hour of the worst season of the worst year. This is actually a line from Boland's poem. Brings together, we could say, various media of remembrance, dating from different periods of time. Furthermore, the ceremony involves what Jackie Alexander would have called palimpsestic memory, in the sense that past and present times appear to coalesce, and present generations are often able to identify with the plights of their ancestors in ways that also generate empathy for similar suffering groups or communities today. A second way in which famine heritage is reframed is with the purpose of emphasizing present injustice. And I owe this information about the exhibition to my colleague Charlie Boerman. During the opening of the photograph exhibition, The Unknown Famine, Athens 1941-1942, in the EU Parliament in Brussels on the 28th of March 2017, European MP Stelios Kouloglou, was actually part also of Syriza, drew explicit analogies between the Greek famine that took place under the Axis occupation 75 years earlier, as represented by the displayed images, and Greece's debt-ridden of that crisis of that very moment. As Kouloglou claimed, the restrictions placed by the EU upon Greece to reorganize its financial condition seemed unjust in light of the famine the country suffered during World War II. There's actually an interview with Kouloglou that you can find on YouTube where he actually says, Greece is suffering and is accused wrongfully for being, disorganized under the present government. And he actually says that the exhibition brings a forgotten famine under the public's attention. And he actually says why that is so important. He says, but this story reminds us why this happened, because Greece was the last country to start the reconstruction after the Second World War. So actually what we see happening is that in this case, famine heritage was used to express critique of the EU's austerity measures, but also to rally support for left-wing Greek politics. In similar fashion, and this is more recent as well, it's still very controversial in the Netherlands, Dutch Farmers' Defence has often recalled the Dutch hunger winter in order to protest against national and EU politics, which forced them to basically shrink livestock as the means to help reduce nitrogen emissions. Thus, already in late 2019, the FDF spokesman, Mark van den Oever, wondered whether Dutch society should refresh its memory of the hunger winter, then 75 years ago, to realize that what farmers did to save their countrymen and women from starvation. And he says they were sharing their own scanty supplies, they were secretly keeping back parts of their harvest and their dairy, for example, to be able to give it to other people. And he says people must have forgotten, for otherwise they would appreciate and support the farmers in their plight. His statements were strongly criticized, amongst others, on the basis of historical accounts included, for example, in an exhibition that was actually at the Resistance Museum, And you can also find a sort of digital exhibition with loads of material about the hunger winter on the website of the Resistance Museum. And when you actually go to that section on the hunger winter, you come across oral testimonies. So little clips of interviews with people who were living during the hunger winter. And when you take a look at that, you find that on the basis of that information, some farmers also really let people down by demanding very valuable goods such as linen and table silver in exchange for money, or by refusing to barter any food at all. This latter example makes clear that heritage can play a significant role in nuancing more radical politicizations of famine past by engaging with oral testimonies or historical data. In fact, one could argue that heritages of hunger, while shaped by ideological iconographies and narrative templates themselves in processes of creation, preservation, and canonization, may also open up alternative or complementary perspectives in looking at European famine pasts. Often, these heritage practices suggest a reassessment of commonly held perceptions of the past on the basis of the recovery of famine legacies through hitherto underexplored texts, images, and even material artifacts. As Jefferson Singer and Martin Conway have argued, for example, some pasts are not really forgotten, but less accessible in the public sphere. This happens when certain legacies are what they call available, but may not be widely accessible at any given moment, because it remains hidden in archives or because people have kept back testimonies of such a past for personal or for political reasons. And this implies, however, that such legacies can potentially be retrieved, and through the retrieval process might enter consciousness again, both on an individual level but also on a public level, and so influence experience and behavior as well. Especially regarding the famine past in Finland and Spain, I think we see such a recovery actually happening in many ways. If we start with Finland, I would like to praise the work done by my colleague Andrew Newby. He's done a lot of work on the famine of 1867-68, which led to high mortality rates. And it had received very little attention in Finland at all, until basically somebody with an Irish background who worked in Scotland and started to live in Finland was taking up this topic. And then after him, of course, Henrik Forsberg was also doing research on the Finnish famine. As Andrew Newby himself actually argued, this famine took place, this is I think an important thing to know, under a devolved administration in Helsinki, even if Finland was part of Russia's empire at the time. After the Civil War and Finnish independence, the famine years in Finland had to be framed as what Newby calls the inevitable economic birth pains of a new nation, pain that that needed to be endured, or as one of several building blocks which helped to create a modern state. And I find it really interesting to basically look upon it that way if we compare it already to the Irish famine, right? There's a lot of this story about the British government failing to provide relief sufficiently. In Finland, it was not a foreign government. It's basically, so you could say, a government of the Finns that is actually located in Helsinki. And it becomes an entirely different story because there's not really like an outsider you want to blame as part of your narrative. And what Andrew Newby actually has done, if we go back to the issue of heritage, he has curated a travelling exhibition that I'm sure some of you may have seen. It's called Nälkä, which actually means hunger in the Finnish language. And it's called The Great Finnish Famine, and it was from 2019. It was hosted actually in many places, as some of you know, National Famine Museum, Strokestown Park, and the Irish Famine Workhouse in Portumna, the Cultural Centre Valve in Oulu, and the University of Tampere. And I think it's a good example of how an almost neglected era of famine may receive renewed interest on both a local, a national and a transnational level through heritage collection and construction. The exhibition, and you can see some pictures of it actually here with Andrew Newby also standing in the picture on the right, on the far right, displayed information panels in combination with images of news reports, engravings from the collection of the National Museum in Helsinki. And these were brought together with local famine monuments photographed by Newby himself, and a few tangible objects such as farm implements from the 19th century and samples of newly baked pine or bark bread, which Newby actually had commissioned from a lady living in the countryside, as a way to represent what emergency fruit would have looked like at the time. Furthermore, as Newby's pioneering research has revealed, one may actually discover more famine heritage in Finland than initially expected by adopting a regional focus. Newby's database of Finnish famine monuments reveals that on a local level, often in parish churchyards, one can find memorials that mark former mass graves, or that generally remember past victims of hunger in these communities. But it's very much a dispersed famine heritage, as you can sort of imagine, right? Finland is already quite a large country. Then you have all these, you could say, little dots on the map which mark a famine memorial on a local level. And it's really hard to put that into a sort of an overarching narrative that roots Finland's years of hunger into a national collective memory. And I think that's an important challenge that people in Finland specifically face. Now, I'll briefly talk about Spain, which is also, of course, the specialization of Miguel and Gloria, who are sitting here. In Spain, the overall reassessment of the Franco dictatorship over the past decade has led to a stronger emphasis on the years of hunger that took place under his rule in general, and a more active use of the term hambre in relation to its repressed but extant legacies. And there are many resources in the form of text, artworks, and especially also photographs. And Gloria collected quite a few for the project database of Heritagesof of Hunger, which document the Spanish hunger years, but which are, again, you could say, well, dispersed over several archives. Up to this date, there has not been an exhibition yet which brings these legacies from the famine years and their aftermath together. But on the 26th of October 2022, La Hambruna Silenciada, Hunger During Franco's Post-War Period, 1939 to 1952, curated by Gloria and Miguel, will open at the Casa Molino de Angel Galive in Granada. And the exhibition is subsidized, I think that's an interesting thing to know as well, amongst others by the Ministry of Justice and Democratic Memory. This is my translation of the Spanish title. And what I think it's sort of showing is that you actually, if you want to have a sort of further impact, you need a lot of societal impulses that help that. Also in the term of, you could say, top-down support or policies which support the acknowledgement of these kind of famine pasts. And bringing them back, you could say, into, well, you could say accessible memory and to collect and to disseminate this kind of famine heritage. So there's something to look forward to for those of you who can still travel to Granada later on in this month, I would say. At the same time, when we think of top-down approaches, right, I think we also tend to feel it's not always a great success. And Emily, who's also sitting here in the room, she's done a lot of research herself about, well, what is the difference between a top-down approach towards heritage policies, where people sort of decide that this is like an important heritage that should be created or recollected or preserved. But you also have what comes from bottom up, right? Sort of the grassroots kind of ideas. You can actually see that sometimes the top-down approach really goes wrong. And there's one example by the tensions that surround the 2018 Glasgow Irish and Highland Famine Memorial. And on the one hand, at first glance, you tend to think this is interesting, right? We have a monument, and it appears to integrate two stories of two suffering people. Actually, you could say two colonial famine pasts occurring around the same time. The Great Irish Famine, obviously, but also the Highland clearances and the 1846 Scottish potato famine. The monument features plants and stone native to Ireland and the Scottish Highlands. And the memorial interprets the journey made by refugees forced to flee home, and is a tribute, as we can read on their website, an acknowledgement to those who experienced famine and helped build the city. And this is actually what the Glasgow city is sort of announced upon the dedication of this monument. But the ways in which the monument, in the shape of a boat, brings together Highland and Irish famine legacies has received critique from various sides, but especially from the local Great Hunger Memorial Committee, who felt really frustrated that the Glasgow City Council, as they said, added on the Highland element because they knew or believed that there were forces in Glasgow even today who would not accept a memorial which involved the Irish alone, as they stated in The Guardian. Furthermore, as representatives of this committee claimed, the scale and extent of what happened to our people, 1 million dead and 1 million forced to emigrate out of a population of 8 million, made the notice of a Highland and Irish famine memorial completely unacceptable to us, and offensive in its very concept. These are really strong words that they are using. So the monument may seem at first glance a sort of, you'd say, an attempt to express a sense of multi-directional memory, right? But actually it's utilized as a futile way to overcome strongly competing memories of famine and colonial oppression that are furthermore reinforced by ethnic and religious differences that we find around Glasgow itself. Now, the Glasgow and Irish and Highland Famine Memorial may wrongly suggest that the formation of a transnational famine legacy, which could evoke sympathy and solidarity with victims of famine or also other atrocities across borders, may be almost like a mission impossible. This is, however, not the case. If you watch what follows, I want to give you a few examples that we can actually see an emergence of what I would like to call a multi-directional turn in the formation of famine heritage. And what you see is this can be a sort of combination of a famine past with other interesting past belonging to other communities. In that sense, sort of creating or suggesting certain similarities or analogies. It could also be another famine, actually, another famine heritage that is being addressed in the same memorial or monument, or other, you could almost say, a piece of heritage that is there to commemorate famine. And I would also like to argue in what follows that I think there is more potential for developing joint comparative heritage initiatives. Let me turn with you to this one. This is a very, as you could say, it's an important lieu de mémoire, one of the earliest ones that actually are inscribed, in my view, by transnational imperial legacies. It was a community-based memorial, so not a top-down initiative, and it's the famine graveyard at the back of the Swinford Hospital in County Mayo. The hospital was built around the remains of Swinford Union Workhouse, which took in sick and starving people during the Great Famine. The grave contains the remains of 564 inmates, and a simple plaque marks its site as erected by the people of Swinford to the memory of 564 famine victims buried in this place. May they rest in peace. Close to the site, a monument was erected which was unveiled by Arun Gandhi, the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi, in 1994. It portrays and quotes Michael Davitt, who visited the grave before he founded the National Land League, and also Indian leader for Indian independence Gandhi himself, while referencing the buried famine victims. Actually, the text that you can find is, "Here lie the remains of hundreds of poor people who died during Ireland's so-called Great Famine." The monument also contains a text which encourages the visitor of the site to continue the struggle for a more just and equitable world, as an expression of respect to the memory of those victims. In this way, the memorial site is truly, I would say, heterochronic and palimpsestic. It merges various slices in time: the Great Irish Famine, the Irish Land Wars, the Indian struggle for independence. But it also involves an absolute break with a traditional time, in that the boundaries between past, present, and a wished-for future also seem to collapse. At the same time, the monument is essentially transnational in the past, from different parts of the British Empire that coalesce. And I find it really interesting to see that. But there are other examples where you can also see sort of an emerging multidirectional European famine memory, more specifically. Basically, where you see actually that different famine paths from Europe are sort of overlapping, interacting, intersecting, and actually sort of make us think of similarities between two different events in time. And Nelke, I come back to that exhibition by Andrew Newby is I think, a very important example. Because as it toured Ireland, Northern Ireland, as well as Finland, Newby incorporated a comparison not just between Finland's years of hunger, but also Ireland's Great Famine on some of the panels that were on display, pointing to shared experiences as well as to the different political context in which both took place. A colonial territory governed from the center of empire on the one hand, but also a devolved government in the colony's own capital on the other. And what is interesting maybe to say about where Nelke was touring, some of you may already have heard that Strokestown Park has set up basically new exhibition spaces. This is the National Famine Museum in Ireland. And Jason King, who works for the Irish Heritage Trust and is also with us today, told me there's actually going to be a small comparison with the famines in Belgium around 1845 in the new exhibitions. And that to me is another example where two famine paths are sort of brought into dialogue with one another. And there are interesting comparisons that actually, probably will spark of, I think, also more research and also more heritage interest, I would say, in the Belgian famine past. Okay, contemporary literature is also interesting to take a look at. It suggests convergences between famine pasts as well. And one such a text is For Freedom Alone from 2018, a novella by a US author, Leah Wade. It depicts how three siblings and their father, Seamus Ross, looked for a new home in Edinburgh in late autumn 1846, after their eviction from their Highland home in Glencalfie. Like many other peasants, they have to leave their land because the landlords seek to replace agriculture by more profitable pasture. And we can read in the text, so they could fill Highlands, hills and glens with fancy Cheviot sheep and with red deer for English gentlemen to hunt. Well, we talked about animals already during the conference, right? And Irene's very interesting paper, and Peter Gray was already making that comment, right, about animals that had to be used for hunting for the elites in a form of animal preservation. The people were starving, and I think the novel is sort of, touching upon this as well. You can see an example of it here. Now, the family in this novel, they arrive after a really long journey on foot and a period of severe destitution and hunger. And the son Rab hopes to find food, thinking of his stomach, which had been empty so long, we can read in the novel. The city is already full of refugees, we can also read, from the Irish potato famine. And the novella brings the so-called Highland clearances and the hunger and homelessness that ensued from them in dialogue with the Great Irish Famine and its diaspora, through a storyline that focuses on the friendship between 12-year-old Rab Ross and 9-year-old Irish-born Sully, short for Sullivan. It is quite evident that Sully's family was badly afflicted by the Irish potato famine. We can read, Sully tells Rab that his family's from Ireland, and he says the taters rotted and there was nothing left to eat there. His mother died of fever and his brother Patrick of the famine, he says. But his father, having taken him to Edinburgh, became addicted to alcohol and abandoned Sully, who was forced to work as a chimney sweeper. The narratives of the Irish famine and the Highland clearances come together in the encounters between the two friends, a narrative intersection which is intensified by two narrative dimensions. First, there's the hunger and deprivation that both characters suffer in Edinburgh as well. It's almost like a continuation of hunger that they experienced in the Highlands and in Ireland. Rep's family has hardly enough to eat and shares a cold, dark and ill-ventilated apartment with distant relatives. Sully, who succumbs to consumption as a result of his labour as a chimney sweeper, ends up slowly dying in his former employer's office, where Rep finds him in the rear of the shop, lying on a low pallet, in the office's shadows, so that it takes a moment for Rep's eye to adjust to the low light so he could see the boy. Now, those of you who've already read, well, I could say narratives of, for example, the Irish famine and people travelling around, or early fiction of the Great Irish Famine, will think, if you read this passage, it really strongly resonates with the descriptions one finds in the early accounts of the Great Irish Famine, which often portray famine victims as shrouded in darkness. For instance, in The Widow O'Leary, a text from 1847, the narrator visits the home of his former acquaintances, Jack and Mary O'Leary, and is shocked to witness the appearance of extreme poverty, disorder and misery that the house has attained since the outbreak of the blight. Entering the dark cabin, the narrator can at first not distinguish what kind of object lies upon the bedstead, but, once accustomed to the darkness, perceives it to be a man, wasted to the greatest degree of emaciation, lying on a litter of waste and covered only by a dirty, ragged quilt. The ways in which this passage from Waite's novella echoes early famine literature is endorsed by the emaciated state of Scully's body. We can read that Rat put his arms around the boy, whose bones he could feel through the thin fabric covering him. And second, what I think is interesting is that Waite's narrative implies connections between the two, basically the two experience of dislocation that the two young boys have to suffer. Both have lost their childhood home and share a dream of going to America, which only Rab manages to realize. And as Scully tells Rab, you'll get to America with your family and you'll take my dreams with you. Stating that memories are not owned by groups, but also, and therefore do not run parallel with group boundaries, Michael Rothberg suggests that different sets of cultural memory exist in sort of dynamic transfers. And as these memories overlap and become inscribed with other cultural recollection, an infinite interactive space of transcultural recollections can come into existence. Waite's text stages such overlapping multidirectional memories of eviction and famine from Scotland's and Ireland's colonial past, and I think it's a really intriguing exercise in trying to do that. These recent examples of comparative transnational famine heritage bear witness to a growing awareness of analogous experiences of hunger in the past. This growing consciousness cannot only be explained by the increasing globalization through the media, but also through migration, but also by the expanding digitization of archives, newspapers, and magazines. In fact, one may witness a transnational turn in famine heritage making that can be connected to the general transcultural trend in memory studies at large. Two concrete examples illustrate this, which both concern a series of monuments that connect lieux de mémoire, places of memory, in the country of origin, where the famine actually took place, but also in diaspora, the place to which many people from that country actually migrated. One example is the famous trilogy of bronze statues made by Rowan Gillespie, which connect the Custom House Quay in Dublin as the famine immigrants' point of departure, with monuments that are in Toronto's Ireland Park, on Irene Quay, and Hobart's waterfront in Tasmania, what is formerly called was Van Diemen's Land. Now, it's interesting to look at the story that these series of statues are sort of telling us. Famine from 1997 in Dublin represents starving peasants who have walked all the way to the emigrant vessel. Migrants from 2006 convey the hope of the migrants, whose bronze images bear exact likeness to the famishing throng in Dublin. It's almost as if you see these people leave and you see them now arrive in Toronto. And this idea of hope, I think that you also see here is also symbolized by the swollen belly of the expecting female passenger who has disembarked, but also the way in which one of the male figures that you can see here on the slide is stretching out his hands to the waterfront and to the heart of the city. This is actually where his future lies. Now, while the monuments in Dublin and Toronto together constitute a narrative in a sense, Footsteps Towards Freedom from 2017 presents an alternative story related to Ireland's Great Famine. The 4 statues embody 4 convict women and serve to commemorate their plights. You can read on the website, while many of these women left conditions of great poverty and in Ireland, famine on arrival, they found themselves in an inhumane system, where they were treated as little more than a commodity. Not only was their labour crucial to the fledgling colony, but they were also considered breeding stock, and this is what the reporter Diane Snowden also states. Although Footsteps Towards Freedom stands narratively a little bit more apart from the other 2 monuments by Gillespie, it further connects Ireland, once afflicted by the Great Famine, to 2 countries where some famine Irish found new homes. The trilogy spans 3 continents and connects the legacies of 3 famine generation communities across the globe. And interestingly, we see the same actually happening with the Holodomor. Where you also have a dialogue, you could say, between the homeland and the various locations in diaspora. And my colleague Charlie is doing a lot of in-depth research also on these monuments in Canada. What you actually see happening here is you have the original image by Petro Drozdowski, which is called Bitter Memory of Childhood, and it's actually standing at the entrance, you could say, of the Holodomor Museum in Kiev. And it's an interesting thing because it's almost like it has counterparts, replicas, also as bronze statues in several locations in Canada, a country which hosts a large Ukrainian diaspora. For example, on the 12th of May 2015, a copy of Bitter Memories of Childhood, made from the same cast as the one in Kiev on the grounds of the National Holodomor Museum, was unveiled at the Saskatchewan Provincial Legislature in Regina. A replica of Bitter Memories of Childhood also stands at the Legislative Building Grounds in Manitoba. And I think these are interesting sites because they're all connected to, you could say, law and justice, and perhaps a suitable location for that very reason. Because the 5 stalks of wheat symbolize the Soviet law that imposed death on anyone caught picking grain from collective farm fields. And at the same time, it also epitomizes this idea of legalized human rights today, and that were not there in the past. Now, in that light, one could also see why a life-size statue, a copy of this statue, after Drozdowski, found its way into Winnipeg's Canadian Museum for Human Rights in 2016. And more recently, in Toronto, a Holodomor memorial was also unveiled. This was in 2018. And comprised of Ukrainian sculptors Petro Drozdowski's iconic Bitter Memories of Childhood again, but set on paving stones that suggest traditional embroidery. It was revealed in 2018, in autumn, as I was already mentioning. And here the legacies of the Ukrainian famine are framed into a narrative of resilience and rebirth through the 3 millstone parks that are also present on the site that suggest that bread can be made again, right? That people can work on their bread again. All these sites in Canada and the monument near the Holodomor Museum in Kiev geographically connect communities, forming a mnemonic network that transcends borders and reaches out to people of other descent as well, because they're really placed, you could say, in these multicultural societies. Moreover, the transnational heritage constellations in which these clusters of memorials are embedded and receive meaning suggest, in my opinion, that we think of monuments as pretty fixed, right? Because you can't easily move them. But if you make replicas like this, and you create a chain of monuments that are sort of similar, you can still make it a bit more like a portable heritage than you would initially sort of expect. Now, photographs, illustrations and text are even more portable heritage, especially in this digital age, when virtual exhibitions and archives have the potential of making European famine legacies more accessible to broader audiences. The fact that these heritage of various European famines, separated even by time and space, tap into very similar repertoires of representation, suggest the potential for further developing comparative approaches. Can we speak of recurring transnational famine iconographies or narrative templates or scripts or schemes? For this, we may take a comparative look at this set of famine monuments that I put on a slide for you. And if you take a really good look at it, this is very interesting because here we have monuments that concern the German famine after World War I by Käthe Kollwitz. It's the image of Brot from 1924. We have the Finnish Hunger Years by Helmi Biese, Susun Nelke Rosi from 1902. It's an illustration to a work of fiction. We have the Kazakhstan Famine Memorial of 2017. And we have the Dutch Hunger Winter Memorial of 1947 made by Hildo Krop. And if you look at them closely, all depict suffering mothers and emaciated children who they are unable to feed, thereby testifying to, you could say, the centrality of maternal figures and European famine iconographies. The right bottom center of Hildo Krop's monument, you see it sort of zoomed out here on the slide, basically a monument dedicated to the memory of the relief offered by the Interkerkelijk Overleg, so you could say the interconfessional organization. And it's situated at the Oosterbruggegracht, depicts a woman and 2 children, symbol for the suffering families during the Hongerwinter. And the family grouping really closely resembles the iconic image of Ireland's Great Famine, Bridget O'Donnell and her children, an engraving by James Mahoney, published in the Illustrated London News of 22nd of December 1849. Now, interesting if we talk about sort of these recurring scripts, right? I've shown you some recurrent iconographies, where recurrent scripts are there as well. And just to give you one example, if you compare Irish famine fiction and Dutch literature of the Hongerwinter, you find very often a sort of central focus on infants and mother figures who are on the road looking for food, but are unable to do so. A very interesting children's book is by Guus Luiters, and it's called The Hongergoochelaar. Let's say it's the hunger wizard, if I would translate it for you into English. And it's a book frequently read at secondary schools in the Netherlands. It tells the story of a former successful variété artist, Grote Mels, who takes in a young girl whom he encounters on the train and who refuses to give her name and her whereabouts. As the narrative unfolds, several clues are given that the girl, whom he names Sintje, is in fact Jewish and has escaped Nazi deportation by fleeing Amsterdam. Initially, Grote Mels can supply abundant food for the both of them. The man has performed as an illusionist and he seems to be able to magically conjure up for the best of food, such as white bread, bacon and eggs. But as of the autumn of 1944, when fuel is no longer available and hardly any food can be obtained, Grote Mels and Sintje have become destitute. They have to walk very long distances through heavy snow and frost in order to obtain something edible in exchange for clothes. They only have a watery beet soup at their disposal, and we can read that their food supplies are decreasing by the day, while they suffer from physical weakness and constant famine. In Dutch it says, Sintje bleef in bed, ze hadden de hele dag honger. Sintje stayed in bed because they were hungry the entire day. In describing the main character's loss of the abundance of food they once had, Luiters' novel is similar to Irish famine narratives such as Mrs. Hall's Little Mary. In a tale from Shamrock Leaves from 1851, the protagonist's stepmother was able to successfully grow cabbages, parsnips and onions in it. And to be sure, she got a fine crop out of it, we can read in the story, enough to make as many nice supper of vegetables, stewed with pepper and a small taste of bacon and red herring. So those were the times of plenty. But this time of plenty is coming to a change, and it's contrasting greatly with the destitution the family suffers during the famine, so that the mother has become faint and weary due to lack of food. And as becomes clear from these examples, you could actually say that European famine legacies tend to resort to similar narrative scripts as well, in giving meaning to that painful past. Now, there's strong analogies between legacies of European famines in terms of themes, tropes and narratives calls for future heritage projects that will take up the challenge of recollecting hunger comparatively, creating a repository of virtual exhibition of famine heritage across Europe may be a feasible manner to realise such a transnational vantage point on the hunger crises that were faced by Europe and beyond. At the same time, a purely digital format may make it difficult to engage today's citizens emotionally. In Mediating Memory in the Museum from 2013, Silke Arnold de Semien argues persuasively that the museum's representation of the past is intended to generate a sense of belonging, which requires emotional investment and identification, sometimes to the extent that it generates the imaginative living through events in order to develop strong forms of affective engagement, right? So people have to see something, they need to be touched by it, because it's almost like a lived experience to them. That's basically the point that Silke Arnold de Semien is making. Often, what we actually see happening now in a lot of these heritage projects, what they do is what is very effective is displaying artifacts, because artifacts bring you back to the time, right, when the famine took place. And it's also really very sort of effective into drawing people into such a distant past. And this is what Museum Rotterdam does in telling the story about the hunger winter during the Second World War. You see, for example, here several of the objects they put on display. And one of them is also the famous ration cards that many of you will also probably recognize from other famine contexts as well. But however, what is a problem is the overall absence of material objects related to European famines. It's really like an obstacle that such heritage sites can face. And it has to do with the fact, obviously, that the people who were living through famines, well, they were often dying or they were emigrating. They were very poor. There were very few objects left that you can actually show. Now, one strategy used by famine heritage makers to make the past come to life, nonetheless, is reenactments. The website of the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam, for instance, shows the film Naar de Boeren, To the Farmers, that was made in 2014 as part of a virtual exhibition about the children transports during the hunger winter. While this film contains some rare original footage and interviews with people who as children were evacuated to the north and taken in by farmers, it also includes short dramatized clips reenacting the evacuations, and you see actually an example of this here. And basically, if people are watching it, if children are watching the clips, they can sort of identify. You can probably see how that works. In Ireland, this appeal to emotionalism, verging on the dramatic and the sensational, for visitors inured to television images in the form of dramatic spectacle, is a guiding principle in the representation of the Irish famine past at the Dovamine village on the Inishowen Peninsula, County Donegal. Among original thatched cabins, which were inhabited, where did I go? Until 1983, one can find a tableau featuring life-size mannequins that express various dimensions of famine suffering. A burial of famished corpses, a mother and child looking for shelter near a scalp, as well as a dramatic eviction scene representing a helpless family facing bailiffs holding out a battering ram. These stage scenes are accompanied by plates with some basic information about the practice of ejectments, emigration and estimated numbers of famine victims. But above all, by signs which voice emotive appeals to the visitors. It says, if you woke up one morning healthy with no illnesses, then you are not one of the million people who won't live to see the next day. And I think that's interesting kind of thing that is being used. So yeah, if you go for historical reliability in the sense of well, you could say very precise information or very precise reenactment, this is not probably what you would be looking for. The exhibits aim for experience rather than detailed historical data, and at the same time are contextualized by references to today's world and existing inequalities. At the same time, the stage displays hark back directly to the repertoire of feminine images that visitors could already be familiar with from other websites or other publications. The displayed scene of a body put on a cart are likewise rooted in media representations of the famine era itself. And you can actually see examples here on the slide, such as Frederick James Smith's funeral in Skibbereen from the Illustrated London News, 30th of January 1847. And the tableau of the famishing mother and child crouched near a scalp similarly reverberates with images from the Illustrated London News, such as the scalp of Brian O'Connor, published on the 22nd of December 1849, and Life in a Scalp, published on the 29th of December 1849, to go with the article Conditions of Ireland, Illustrations of the New Poor Law. Now, the strong appeal to affect with an A, generates may shift the balance away from educating visitors on the basis of historical data. The second strategy that museums use to overcome this lack of artifacts is by inserting objects not dating from the famine eras themselves, but slightly earlier on into their displays, and to create a sense of a famine narrative. And this is what Andrew Newby did for Nelka, for example. He was exhibiting tools used in the Finnish countryside from about the time of the famine. Likewise, the Museum of Country Life in Turlough presents turf and potato baskets as well as fishing nets to tell the story of rural Ireland in the 1840s. And as Liam Doherty, director of the Irish Folklife Division, National Museum of Ireland, recently observed, these tangible objects are important because tables and tabulations may enhance our understanding, but our empathy less so. Right? I think this quote is so much an illustration of what I was already pointing at. He actually says numbers are bleak, chilling, and difficult from which to elicit an appropriate emotional response. Now, a risk of this approach, however, is losing historical accuracy. And the reinterpretation of the Mina Gara cottage at the Austro-American Folk Park, built 40 years after the famine, but exhibited as a typical famine cottage, is actually an example in case that you could sort of be thinking about. And basically also there was an interesting project at the University of Cork. I don't have time to go into that now, but it was sort of a reconstructed famine cabbage that actually stood on the grounds there on the university campus. Visitors could enter, could get sort of an experience of what such a hut looked like. But of course, it's not the real thing. It's still sort of a reconstruction of what things looked like in the past. And I think we always have to be aware of that as well. So in conclusion, there is a fine line, Arnold de Simena observes, between the historian's investment in the authentic object, which can provide a wealth of information to the initiated, and the fetishistic belief that an object has somehow soaked up the events in which it has played a role and allows a spectator to feel that they are in the presence of the past. This is certainly true for the legacies of European famines, which are often not yet accessible, disposed over archives, recently rediscovered, but which nonetheless offer very interesting potential, and I hope I've shown that convincingly, for transnational integration, but also academic investigation. International collaborations between famine heritage makers and academics, which we also do in our Heritage of Hunger project in Nijmegen, will open up unique opportunities to learn about other European famines and their legacies, but also to exchange curating strategies. How to engage especially younger audiences with these famine past, how to balance engagement and information, but also how to involve new European citizens who are migrants and refugees themselves, for example, and who may have experienced deprivation and hunger. These are really important questions, but they're questions for future agendas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marguérite, for this interesting lecture. So now we have some time for discussion. So there's some questions.
Well, thanks very much, Marguérite. I found that absolutely sort of fascinating and highly informative survey of the whole field. There are 2 points which I'd like to raise.
Yes.
One is slightly more pleasant, one which I think some things that being produced will be added. Another one I'm really worried Adding to the iconography, I mean, I think the Russian famine of 1921 has such amazing posters. Dmitry Moore's Pomagi, peasant holding up his hands, being in a straw threat. It seems to be one of the most remarkable things. I'm sorry you haven't been including any of the remarkable iconography of posters actually used at the time in support of an appeal within the country, as well as we have. Also within Russia, at that time they produced famine magazines, which were distributed in order to help make awareness of the problem available to others. And some of them actually coming out of the Volga region, some of them sounding a little bit grotesque in some regards, where people were rewarded with food for writing contributions to the magazine that was then going to be distributed. But if you want a real head-on, raw look at people involved in it, I would certainly recommend, if you want to already aware of them, some of these Volga 1921 famine appeal materials.
Great, yeah.
Okay, now something slightly different. The way you framed this right at the beginning fits in totally with general propaganda and legal accounts of what is going on at the moment, but for people with a specialist knowledge of the problem may not necessarily be totally correct. So, Putin's blockade of exporting grain from the Black Sea, with therefore Ukraine food supplies not being available to feed the starving in Africa. You've got to realise that, Ukrainian major grain export is maize. Maize is used predominantly as livestock feed. Livestock feed produces meat, and that's one of the reasons why meat prices in the more developed world has gone up. Russia is the largest exporter of wheat. 20 million tons of wheat exported. Russia is also the largest exporter of fertilizer. Now, the reason why there's a meat shortage, you could attribute directly to the Ukrainian maize not getting out. But if you want to look at why world agriculture is being threatened, it's largely because of a shortage of fertilizer. If you're looking at why wheat supplies are particularly short, it's largely because of wheat exports not coming out. And of course the Russians can quite easily pass these all over to China, so we're probably being very foolish in partly producing a problem here. Why is Russian exports not coming out? Well, it's not a physical blockade of ships stopping, although a lot of mines have been placed around the Black Sea, making this difficult. But it's largely because of the American banning of financial institutions having dealings with Russia. So to some extent, it's the American embargo that is actually threatening the food supplies for the underdeveloped world. But for various reasons, I mean, you're perfectly correct. The way you present it is the way it is always presented in the media. But if you want a slightly more, specialist, informed view of it, then you may have to take make a statement which will earn lots of unpopularity. It's not what your grant givers or governments want to hear. But I thought in an academic audience, it would be wrong for me not to actually point out a few realities that seem to be slightly missing in the introduction.
Marguérite, do you prefer answering one per one, or do we join some?
questions and then...
I'll just respond to Stephen's points, I think, first, right? I think that's first of all, many thanks for the famine writing information that you were bringing up. And I was not aware of it, but it's very important, I think, for the project, and especially for two of my team members who are also sitting here to investigate that further. I mean, of course, I knew about how propaganda for food was also used in Germany with the Koolweed illustrations that also become part of an appeal for food. But this is really very useful additional information, so many thanks for that. And as to the second point, you're so right. I mean, but this is what is happening in the media, and that's what I try to sort of point out, is you get a framing of events, right? And they are framed in a certain way. And historians with a lot of background information and details are not the people who write these kind of articles, apparently, in the media. And you get a different kind of perspective, but it's again a frame or a sort of script that is imposed on an event from which other things are sort of left out. And I was not really aiming for the historical accuracy here, obviously, but really showing how it's done in the media field, as how they sort of use that heritage and utilize it. But it's very refreshing to have perspectives, like yours, right? Very informed perspectives to the table also here at the conference to basically show us that things are much more complicated than the media are representing to us. Yeah.
Oh, okay, Amy, go ahead.
Thanks, Marguérite.
Sorry, the next.
I have two questions for you. Obviously, we've been both working in this field a long time, you in terms of literature and me in terms of monuments. And it just strikes me that many of the trends you're observing, you know, they're things that you've been writing about for a long time, things I've learned, you know, from my book from 10 years ago. You know, transnational famine legacies, shared iconographies, multi-directional memory, which goes by lots of other names within memory theory. And these were things that we've been, you know, in my book observed these were happening 30 years ago. So my first question, I suppose, is that it's related to the fact that nothing really seems to have changed, except perhaps the density of this activity, which is part of a function of time, and also perhaps the increased flattening of historical specificity, which in my view actually is a function of the internet. Because when I was looking at monuments that were constructed in the 1990s, those were committees that were doing that independent of actually an online community. And that's actually, for me, I've seen that as being a real kind of game changer when it comes to this. So we see this sort of flattening happening of historical specificity. And I'm a little bit more cautious about attaching positive values to multi-directionality. I don't necessarily think it's a positive thing. So that's, I suppose, my first question is what do you think is different about what's been happening in terms of some of the things you're looking at? Because that attaching of, you know, famine legacies to migrants, I mean, that's been happening in Ireland since the 1980s, like actually from Ireland Concerned, or like the first ones to do that. So that's my first question. And my second one's much shorter, and I suppose it's related. And it's about this position, and this kind of comes, I think, in some ways to maybe what Stephen was asking about as well. And it's about our sort of self-reflexivity as scholars. And this position between being scholars and anthropologists of memory versus being evangelists of it. And that's something which I still find a very difficult combination of positions to occupy, and I tend to be a little bit more, I think, it is a conflicted position. And as we know, our work is typically tended to be used ideologically by lots of other kinds of parties. And I am a little bit more cautious about this sense of we as historians crafting memory, because I'm not so certain that that's actually our job.
Yeah, valid questions. Let me first start with your first one. I think you're right in calling it a growing density, I think, of the multidirectionality. Because, you tend to see that more often, at least that's my experience also with the new Strokestown panels I was just talking about, for example. When I heard the news that they were going to include a bit on the Belgian famine as well, I was like, wow, this is interesting. But there's several sides to it. On the one hand, I think maybe you can make monuments multi-directional, but communities are not always ready for it. And we're still in a sort of an arena of competing memories, where people claim a certain uniqueness, I think, for a certain famine past. So you see that happen a lot. On the other hand, you see also this branching out and comparisons being made that I think could be useful. because you tend to think maybe if you're in a certain national context, oh, we were really the victims of one of the biggest dreadful episodes of European history. It nuances things as well, I think, if you make memory in dialogue, I think. And it's not that you sort of memory making. When you make an exhibition, you bring things together, right, that are already there.
You are making memory.
You are, yeah, in a sense, yeah.
You're making the thing that a PhD student in 20 years is going to study.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. But you're creating a sort of inner narrative, but there could be good things about that. But I think it's a balancing act, as you also say, if you do a thing like this, like a sort of comparative exhibition, by showing there are also differences, right? As Andy did in his Nelke exhibition. So you may want to make comparisons, but also please be aware there are also differences. But it's this balancing act, I think, between keeping things really historically accurate and specific. But also I think this idea that this is not unique, right? This is actually something that is a sort of European shared experience legacy, but in different moments of time and in different ways, but nonetheless sharing certain repertoires or replicating certain repertoires. I think it could open up, I think, a lot of interesting dialogues and perspectives that change also our perceptions of some people as, you could say, the perpetrators, the people who created famines, which is a lot what people would think of in terms of Germany. But they can also be seen as victims of famines themselves, right? They also have had their own famines and they've also had their own famine legacies. And I think that could be a very useful approach in nuancing that kind of picture. Yeah, is that sort of answering your question a bit? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, I have more of a comment. And first of all, thank you for presenting this. The overview of the project is looking at the transnational level, on the European level. I've been waiting for this to see what you're doing. But my main comment is about, I think you're misrepresenting the impact of Andrew Newby and his exhibition as a whole here. You have on one hand, you have his impact on the Finnish side of memory, and then the other, you have the impact on the international sort of scholarship community, and we should not mix those two. Now, Andy is my friend, is my mentor, and is a valuable asset. But putting his exhibition as a retrieval of famine memory in Finland is sort of downplaying all the work and all the other activity has been going on, which is shown in his own work that is spoken about, investigation about the local memories and monuments. And then you have the scholarship of Antti Häkkinen, Kari Pitkänen, Oila Turpeinen, and which he's standing upon. So he's an influence, and at best I would say this exhibition it's not a retrieval of memory, because there is no memory, but a reactivating of historical interest into that topic.
I'm not sure whether I agree with you on that, Henrik, because let me frame it. I mean, the work done by other people that you were also mentioning is very important, academically speaking, but it's very much socio-economic, historical kind of work. And what I think what Andy's been doing is, for example, charting cultural heritage and cultural memories of them. And I think that is very much more pioneering in the sense that he was making all these photographs, right, of monuments in the countryside. And of course they are there. They are like sites of memory that are already there on the regional level. And you're right in saying reactivating, but I would say reactivating a sense of memory in the sense that people become aware there is much more in this country actually. And of course there are differences here between, I would say, the academic publications that people make and that are very valuable and that really deal with, you could say, the historical socio-economic realities of the Finnish famine, for example. But I'd really like to sort of distinguish that from how his work is also trying to impact the public sphere and make people aware of that. So, and I would also say on a national level, of course, there were interviews with Andy on the radio in Finland, and people wanted to know about it. But I also tend to feel that there was much more interest in his work and in an Nelke exhibition outside of Finland, more internationally speaking. And I think that is the interesting complexities of feminine heritage, is that the word regional, I think, was used a lot already during the conference. I think there's a lot happening on a regional level, but there's not often a sense of an overarching national awareness or even a transnational kind of impact that is already existing. And if that is the case, anything you do to sort of collect or point out or chart anything that is existing, this is already existing memory. Of course, you make memory by creating that into a sort of an exhibition and by creating a website. And it's like an important intervention, you could say, again, in the public sphere, but it's also based on things that already sort of exist. But it's an interesting dynamic, I think, because it can show us how you can work with things that are already there, and by curating an exhibition or by creating a website or a repository, you make it, this again is availability, accessibility issue. You can make it available, I think, or accessible as well to a wider audience, and it could change awareness in the country on a national level too. It doesn't mean it will have to. It remains to be seen, right? I think in Spain we could say the same things.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But still, I mean, you're missing all the cultural. There's a lot of cultural work that's been going on. There are documentaries, there's novels, there's textbooks, and it remains to be seen what's the impact Andrew has on that for the forthcoming decades. But there's been, like, prior to when he came to Finland and started doing this work, there's been a lot going on.
Sure.
So it's...
Yeah, but it's an example I'm mentioning, right? And there are many people in the field who do this kind of work. I mean, we have several people here in Spain, right, doing the retrieval work as well.
Yeah.
And we've also have the Centro Documental de la Memoria Histórica playing an important role. Yeah. Yeah, so sometimes it's academics like Gloria and Miguel, and sometimes it's also the people who work in a museum sector, for example. But don't underestimate another role or group is teachers. That's also part of the bigger project we have in Nijmegen. That will be showcased a little bit in the panel that's following. Teachers intervening in making textbooks and changing things. And Gloria, when she was working with us in Nijmegen, has also been working on the textbooks and found, I thought that was really interesting, Gloria, that often people talked about the black markets in the Francoist era, but they were never attaching the term hambre.
Yeah, not in Bruno, but generally Spanish hunger years or other euphemisms such as shortages or not famines.
Yeah, and that's an important intervention too, right? And of course you work with what is already there, but you're nonetheless an important group of agents that suddenly foreground, I think, a famine past that people will not have looked upon as maybe a famine before, but there is a lot in the archives telling us the story of a famine. And that's interesting, and I think academics, educators, heritage makers, that's an important dialogue that we should not be missing out on in many ways.
Yeah, Lindsay.
Thanks. Your lecture makes me feel proud to be part of the project group, so happy to be here. I have maybe not a question to answer directly, but something maybe to mull over, which is related to Emily's points. In relation to the memorial you mentioned in Glasgow, right, which combines Scotland and Ireland, that made me think of a term cacophonous memory, right? So the idea that in several monuments today what's happening is that they're combining different sort of recollections, different periods in the past, and that this on the one hand is very good because it sort of equates these different types of memory, and in this case different types of suffering. Yeah. But what it can also do is that it can silence specificity and can silence sort of differences that do exist. Yeah. And I wonder maybe that's sort of a fruitful concept to sort of continue on in relation to a monument like this, whether you think it reflects maybe also the criticism that you mentioned in relation to that monument.
Yeah. I try to think of what exactly the question is.
What do you think of the applicability of that, of a term like that for that specific monument, or for rather this question about, say, combinational sort of memorial, so to say? Yeah. I think what is important, if you talk about all these material images, right, that I was sort of putting on a slide, is you see a sort of shared repertoire.
But you're right in saying that the contexts are different, because if we look at the memorial in Amsterdam, and this is for the role that the churches together played in making sure that children were evacuated to areas where there was food, right, and that we would have better chances to survive. So if you would do like a sort of, for example, a virtual exhibition, and you would bring in the images like this, that context of the children transport is, I think, very essential, right? And I think that's probably what you mean, Lindsay, right? And that when you look at another image, which is iconographically very similar, but is part of a different kind of historical context, we need that awareness too. And I totally agree with that. But it's interesting to bring the narratives into dialogue with one another, but then you can still be specific, I think.
Yeah. No, my point here is also, I think that it's important to keep up this discussion and keep up that specificity. I'm all for seeing ties and seeing bonds, but I do see the issues here of maybe specific groups not feeling sufficiently acknowledged through sort of these comparisons.
Yeah.
And what we think of that as a second status scholars is of course a different thing.
Yeah, sure.
But it is interesting, and I think important to keep owning that dimension.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely true. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Marguérite, for your wonderful overview. I have a short question about narrative scripts. You showed that one of these scripts traveled across Europe, even the world, the mother with a suffering child. Did you come across any other narrative scripts that travel across the world? But then perhaps other representations. We had the panel yesterday with resistant women or women in the queue. Yeah, I don't know whether there is a male iconography which travel around the world, or is this the main iconography which is being used and reused?
Definitely not. And I think this is what we try to sort of, how do you say it, to excavate with the repository we're making with the project. So we make like a database with all the monuments, images, text, music, whatever we have about certain famines. You can also group them according to themes, and what we do in the repository is we attach certain labels to them, and by doing that we see all of a sudden that other kinds of template scripts or iconographies are also emerging, as you could say, hey, this is what actually a lot of these famine legacies are sharing. To me, this idea of traveling and being on the road is an important template as well, that you see in the Netherlands with the Hongertochten, for example. You see it a lot in the Great Irish Famine with the people who have to walk long distances to the emigrant vessel, for example. There are several ways of looking at that, and one of the stories that Andy Newby translated, for example, is also about a family trudging through the snow by the roadside, having a sleigh with them, but hardly surviving the weather conditions. That's another one that you find, for example, and there are several possibilities, but I think at the end of the road, right, we're now in the process of completing the entries for the database. This is what we can distill as well at a certain point, right? What are the kind of recurring images, recurring plot lines, scripts that you come across to give meaning to certain famines, but also to expose differences, right? I think both of them will become visible. But
Okay, there is question by Irina and then Miguel and then Corporaal.
Okay, my comments, thank you so much for your very inspiring lecture, and I probably will stick to two comments regarding the previous discussion on female as main figures and children. You also mentioned the children were the main figures in the monuments. And I have kind of a problem with portraying famine with the help of these two figures, basically mothers, men, and children, because in this case you can see how both of them are victimized, while at the same time, in my research on children practices of survival and materiality, I can see that in fact they have more opportunities to survive, and they would help their families, and they were very active agents of survival for their local communities and for themselves as well, while elderly people and men would die first of all, compared to women and children. So, but it is connected with the way how famine was kind of interpreted and popularized in order to get some social and financial support, in many cases. So what you think about it, it's one comment, and the other comment regarding this tensions, like with this monument in Glasgow, maybe you can also comment and relate it to the a bigger issue that you mentioned about colonial legacies.
Yeah.
For instance, in Kingston, where I now studying in Ontario, there is a monument to also Irish immigrants. There is a couple of them, a graveyard, and also a drinking fountain to commemorate the Irish workers who immigrated after the famine, but also who worked to build a canal, connecting Ottawa with Ontario Lake. So it means just in case it's you could build much bigger picture, and you could include this colonial legacy and monuments to the Irish people and how they were exploited later, what happened with them in this new lands, which still belong to this British Empire. So in general.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. And you're totally right. We have different historical records and data, and they differ from, I think we have to be aware again, from the kind of images or representations. It's repertoires of representation that we're thinking about, that people have utilized and developed, that are sort of they are sort of rooted in the gender ideologies of a certain community, of a certain time, for example. But also they have a sort of an emotional appeal that people think will work, right, in order to sort of elicit donations or relief. There's always a sort of tension or friction between those two things. So thanks for pointing that out. I think you're so right in saying that. Who was?
Well, thank you very much for your lecture, Marguérite. It made me think about other examples of transnational memory. I think that, for instance, about the Spanish Civil War or even the Spanish political styles, there are many examples of all this traveling. So I think that can be applied to other examples of our European history. But I think that something that struck me from your presentation is that it proves why history matters in terms of not only the history that we write, but also how the rest of the society understands history and use history in order to create an identity or to follow a certain political agenda.
Yeah.
Of course, we call that memory instead of history, right? But what I think is that from your presentation, it's clear that there are tensions commemorating, especially in certain aspects, especially in the monuments from a point of view, because I think that I'm following the path that Lucy had just pointed out. Because there are silences, okay, who built the monument, why it was built, for what reason, its aspect. I think that it's highly illuminates in the last Keith Low's book, Prisoners of History, because monuments at the end pass, show us that we are prisoners of the past. But on the other hand, we use it for certain purposes. So if I would have a critique, it's not exactly a critique, but it would be more like being not very optimistic about the remembrance and the memories of famines, is that I believe that they can cause an impact on education, on the society, on in the way we understand life, in the way we face the problems that we have now. For instance, the queues that we're having in Europe due to the inflation, this kind of stuff, or what's happening in Ukraine. I think that can make a change. Obviously, I believe more than I don't believe more in education than in what the states or the international institution, use can do of the past. Because honestly, I think that famines can be used and have been used for political purposes, for the creation of national identity, for silencing the past, and I think that this is a dark side of remembrance. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, and these dark sides are certainly there, and it remains a minefield, I think, to do this kind of work. But nonetheless, at least we can try to bring certain narratives maybe more closely together as academics, as heritage makers, as teachers, showing an awareness of well, there are sort of similar pasts that we all have. But nonetheless, and I think I really wanted to make that clear too, that the accuracy of dealing with the past, should not just be about you appeal to somebody's emotions, right, to draw them in, because all in all that remains very superficial. But you should also really be aware of this is a history, and history is an important thing to study in relation to this, because this gives you more concrete data about a certain past as well. And that balancing act, I think that is what we deal with in our bigger project, but in society in general as well.
Yes, I'll be brief. I enjoyed the talk and the discussion too. I think it's been very good. I come to this from a slightly curmudgeon perspective, that history isn't central to what goes on in heritage and monuments and commemoration and so on, and that so much of the history is oversimplified and distorted. That maybe the people who make the monuments and who commission the monuments don't consult historians enough. Maybe that is because they would find what historians have to say inconvenient. I'm not sure. But like, one of the good things about coming to conferences like this is you learn about things that you should have known about at home. I was talking to Emily, I think it was yesterday, about this controversy in Glasgow about the monument you showed there, the dual Highland Irish famine monument, and Emily mentioned that Tom Devine, who's I suppose the grand old man of Scottish history, was somewhat involved in this, and I was reminded of, if you like, the tension between the titles of two works by Tom Devine. On the one hand, he has this book called The Great Highland Famine, and on the other he has a piece, I forget now where it was published, but the title is Why the Highlands Did Not Starve. And you know, how could a famine be great if people didn't starve? And in fact, the truth is, as far as I can see, because I did a bit of work on this in the last few years, in the Highlands of Scotland, by the kind of definitions we have of famine, we would not call what happened in the Highlands a famine at all. Excess mortality was minimal. And the irony is, and it's an unpleasant memory, one of the reasons why the Highlands escaped lightly is that so many people had been evicted. Scotland did its evicting before the famine, whereas in Ireland a lot of the eviction happened during the famine. And that contrast, I think, is an uncomfortable one to handle. I think it's one that should be studied more. You know, was there in fact the kind of trade-off I'm talking about?
Yeah.
You know, did the kind of cruel treatment by Scottish landlords from the late 18th century on into even the 1840s, did that in some sense minimize what happened in Scotland? Of course, I would accept that there probably was a famine in Scotland at that time, but it wasn't in the Highlands, it was in the cities. And it was a byproduct of the Great Irish Famine, of immigration by Irish migrants into the slums in the cities, which caused some of them to die, but which also caused quite a few local Scots to die of infectious diseases. And that created its own tensions as well. And the results of those tensions, I suppose we still live with, you know, tensions between Catholics and Protestants in the cities of Scotland. So I think those are uncomfortable issues. And you know, if there is any reflection of the famine, the Irish famine in Scotland, it's probably through that side. And it's much more difficult actually to commemorate that and to tell a kind of a feel-good story about it, you know.
And Tom flipped, you know, his
Exactly.
in the midst of that monument building process. He changed from one side to the other in terms of being anti-monument at the beginning and pro at the end.
And this is the kind of conflict historians find themselves in when they are maybe dragged into these situations and to some extent made use of, you know.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentation, very interesting. I'm not sure if my question is out of the topic, so I'm sorry in advance if it is, but I was wondering, you talk about heritage in terms of sculpture and literature and whatnot. Do you also study in the field of language and cultural traditions? And I'm thinking about the case of China, for example. Yeah. Of course, there's been so many famines in history. They have it very much in their culture. So, for example, if you're invited into a restaurant or to somebody's house to eat, it is not good if you eat everything. You always have to leave something in your plate, otherwise it means you're hungry and it's not well said, which is very different from Western culture, or also in language. So in colloquial, when you say hello, you say chupamama, which means have you eaten? And to say yes, I'm good, it's yes, I have eaten, even if you have not eaten. It's a response, right? So I was wondering if you also study in your discipline this type of maybe famine legacy, and if you can put some examples if that's the case.
Well, I'm also looking at my project members, but yeah, we really have to restrict ourselves to some things because there's so much. And I can't really think of any practices. Well, we look at cooking books with alternative things, right?
Yeah, recipes books, for instance. So regarding the Spanish case, anthropologists have studied these kind of continuities between traumatic past or past legacies and current practices when eating, for instance.
Yeah.
So yeah, they have found that among the elderly, there are still some practices that come from the Spanish hunger years. For instance, they eat a lot and they make great efforts to achieve their grandchildren eat a lot too, or they are trying to save in big amounts of food, above all in difficult times, or they always have their fridge so full of food. Or in the Spanish case, it's a very illustrative, the case of bread, because it has a very symbolic power, and the value considered to bread by the elder people in Spain is so huge, so is enormous, and they feel that they have not eaten if they have not eaten with bread, a piece of bread, and they eat bread with everything, with fruits, with all kind of things. So I think these kind of practices come from Spanish hunger years, and of course some recipes are continue to be prepared nowadays, and they are original from Spanish hunger years, such as patatas al vapor or amigas or those kind of recipes. So in Spanish case, these kind of continuities and legacies we're talking about have been studied by anthropologists.
Can I just make a quick comment regarding the question that just mentioned? In my research regarding connection between animals and famine and human practices of survival, I found there are in Ukrainian language and in Russian as well, there are several proverbs relating to being hungry as a dog. And with cats is the same. So pets and household animals, they also enter into language, culture, and traditions, and usually it refers to being hungry or malnourished. So there's these connections. Like, so you wanted to explain that you are hungry, you would say probably related to household animals. So it is there, and it should be there also in other languages.
Yeah, or in relation to your comment, Irina, there are some continuities in language too, as I was explaining. And for instance, there is an expression in Spanish language which says no te den gato por liebre, which comes from the Spanish Hunger Years. It basically means that, so it's like a kind of prevention against being cheated and not to receive a rabbit instead of, a rabbit instead of a cat.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it comes from those consumption practices during Spanish Hunger Years, when people had to eat animals which were not culturally accepted,
Mm-hmm.
and which were not in their everyday life preparations. So yeah, there are many continuities and the legacies coming from the past hunger.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or just to add, sorry.
Sorry, I'm just looking. I should have actually mentioned earlier, there was a film. You haven't said anything about film, but presumably film does come into your area. And I was thinking, picking up Cormac's point, the problem of what could very usefully be done,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in relationship to something like film,
Yeah.
where filmmakers are absolutely notorious for give me a bit of war shot, give me a bit of hunger shot coming from here. Several years ago, and I was just thinking about it, it shocked me a little bit, but 40 years ago, I was very interested in finding the Save the Children Fund film that had been made in the famine of 1921.
Okay.
I went to the Save the Children Fund, which is still operating. They found someone who was very old who said, they thought they gave it to the British Film Institute. I went to the British Film Institute and said, yes, it's here. I said, can I see it? They said, sorry, you can't. It's on nitrate stock. If we put that through a projector, it'll explode. They said, if you'd like to give us, I think it's £500, we could make a copy for you. And I did get Birmingham University to cough up the money. So we actually have a couple of, in fact, they sent the crew out there twice. It's actually extraordinary film. Nansen was visiting on one occasion. They filmed Nansen visiting and taking out a spoon and put it in the gruel, and you can see him eating it. And there was a doctor next to him. That doctor was going to have typhus the next week. So there's all sorts of things there. But one of the interesting things about the film is that you see it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Lutz Becker put together a documentary about the blockade of Leningrad.
Mm.
So this is actually food provided by the West in 1921 to stop Russians from dying from famine, presented in an East German documentary as if it was in 1918 of children flying. The ARA were a little bit slower in getting into this field, but they do have, they did send out some of their crews. So Hoover, you've got a bit of film material. But it did seem to me that it would be a very useful task for someone to try to find out where all these bits of film are, and then give a precise and accurate kind of description what it is. So when you see the film that Lutz Becker is presenting as famine in Petrograd in 1990, you can actually say, well, actually it isn't that, it's exactly the opposite.
Exactly.
But I think that would be a very useful task for someone doing your kind of work. And film must be good. So we do have this tremendous film of the 21 famine, but I mean, any famine after that, there has to be lots of film.
Yeah, but there is. We're also sort of, charting quite a few in our repository. And Charlie, one of the junior members of the team, will also present about that this afternoon, so you'll hear more about it. But you're right in the sense that there is actually a lot. And some are very sort of, you could say, independent, almost privately funded kind of initiatives. Some are very propaganda-like films that have been made. Some are blockbusters, right? And they serve different purposes again. And it really affects the narrative of what you see, But I like the tip you just gave about the 1920s film. Thank you for that.
I just wanted to add, so to briefly add a comment regarding Lotte's question about narrative scripts, because I've been thinking about some not templates, but some common patterns when we presented famines. And for instance, I found some connections between some kind of representations in the Spanish case and other case studies in Europe. I'm thinking about madness, for instance, which appears in Gotisolo's novel about a place in Almeria, which appears in other European famines in the past, such as the Great Irish Famine. Or I'm thinking about starving bodies of children or women, which I think is an image which is present in different case studies too, is repeated. Or, for instance, about substandard houses representations, I think could be another common pattern, or I think Cormac mentioned slums in cities too. So yeah, they are all present in Spanish case, and I think could be a connection.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, okay, it's time for a coffee break, I think.
Yeah.